one of the first early theorists of systems, or scientists to take the whole idea of systems seriously. The idea has been around for a long time, but one of the guys to really talk about it well is a guy by the name of John Gall.
Okay.
And he wrote a book that's now out of print, but I was able to get a copy, called Systemantics, which is kind of a weird word, but a lot of useful things in there. And one of the central concepts, which I think is critically important when you're thinking about putting some type of system together, is what's called Gall's law. And I'll read it to you verbatim, because it's worth examining. Okay. Gall's law is a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. The inverse proposition also appears to be true. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be made to work. You have to start over, beginning with a simple system.
Okay.
Okay? Great example of this, actually, in the computer technology market.
Okay.
Okay. So Microsoft built up its business by, at first, being a simple system that worked. They created MS-DOS, which was very simple, operated on IBM computers.
Okay.
And then over time, it became more and more complex. So they had DOS, and then they developed Windows, which was more complex. And then they created more features, and that was Windows 95, and more features 98, and then XP. And then, by the time they reached about XP, and then Windows 2000 and things like that, they had built, it was a very complex system, but there were a lot of things in that worked. Okay?
Right.
Then
they were just like adding features as they went along?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so they started with something simple, and it evolved to add new capabilities as it grew.
Got it.
Okay, then what happened is that with Windows XP, there were a couple of failures of, ME and, all of these other things that didn't work. And so the company at one point decided that, you know what? This system is getting old. We need to develop something new. We're going to start from scratch here. And they created Windows Vista. Now, Windows Vista, they completely rewrote, new file system, new everything.
Wow.
And it was horribly slow and buggy and crashy. And many people who installed Vista, upgraded from Windows XP, actually decided to take Vista off and go back to this old operating system that actually did what they wanted to do. Okay? And that was a big problem for Microsoft, right? Yeah. So instead of starting with a simple system that worked and then building on top of it, they decided to create the most complex thing that they had ever created from scratch. Okay, and it totally didn't work. Now, parallel. Apple Computer went through the same thing. Early versions of the Apple operating system were very simple. And they built it up and built it up and built it up and built it up until they reached version 9 of the Mac operating system. And then they found that there were some limitations in this system, and so they wanted to create something new, Mac OS X. Instead of doing what Microsoft did and creating something new from scratch, what they did was they found a system. There was an operating system called FreeBSD, which is based on Linux and Unix, which also developed from very simple things into something very complex. And they took FreeBSD, and they started with that as a base. And then they built on top of it, and they built this beautiful interface and all of these things. Okay. But the core things that needed to work were already there.
Got it.
Okay? So they started with a simple system that worked, and they made it more complex into a more complex, beautiful thing that worked. Okay? That's an example of how to use Gall's law. Okay? You must start with something simple.
Okay.
Think of this as iteration.
Right, right.
If you've never built a car before, building a car from scratch is difficult. Right? There's a lot of interconnected things that are all really important that if they're not there or they don't function, you're not going to have a very good car.
Right.
Okay? Learning how to build a motor first is probably a good idea before you try to build a car.
I totally see it. Yeah.
So Gall's law is one of the core reasons from a system standpoint why iteration and prototyping and continuously improving your product works so well as a value creation methodology, because you're starting with something simple and you're making it more complex.
I think it's another good it's another good reason not to be afraid of making a minimum economically viable product, because then you at least have something that works.
Exactly.
For people like me who would like to go to the concrete or the terrible, horrible, huge thing first.
Right.
It's a good reminder.
And then you build on that thing that works, and then you make it better.
That's
and
good.
if you try a change that doesn't work,
you can always go back.
Yeah, you go back to the thing. But if you try to build something very complex from the start, it probably won't work. And according to John Gall, it can never be made to work.
Okay.
You always have to start with something simple.
All right.
That is Gall's law.